recording. Just let me get confirmation. You're ready to go.
All right, great. Okay, so we're going to start. So Shalom Aleichem and Moadim L'Simcha. First, in the context of Passover, I just want us to all be spared from plagues, current and historical. And I want to welcome all of you to our virtual book launch for Laughter After, Humor and the Holocaust, which you can't see in my background, but you can see the background, which is edited by David Slucki and Gabriel N and me. My name is Avinoam Patt, and I'm the director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life at the University of Connecticut, where I also serve as Doris and Simon Conover Chair of Judaic Studies. I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight for this extraordinary program, which here in Hartford was rescheduled from what we originally had as an April 1st launch date to take place at the Mandel Jewish Community Center in West Hartford, where Ferne Pearlstein was going to also be showing her film that evening, which we will do. And I do want to say that we are indeed living in a time that is frightening and really without precedent in our lifetimes. And I want to start by acknowledging the courageous efforts of all of our healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, healthcare professionals, first responders, and more for their truly heroic efforts to respond to this crisis. We wish them a großen Yishal Koyach, sei gesund und stark. May they be healthy and strong. So today's program is sponsored by our amazing friends at Wayne State University Press, some of whom are here with us on the call, and we can see the headquarters of Wayne State behind us. We appreciate you so much, and we are so happy that you are all there. So thank you, Emily, and thank you, Kathy, and thank you to all our friends at Wayne State University Press. I want to say that copies of the book are available. Emily has shared a link to the Wayne State University Press website where you can go to order copies of the book, which of course are available on Amazon. But I also would ask you to please consider ordering from your local bookstore as well, who, as we know, need our support now more than ever. Now, before we begin, I just want to offer a few notes on how all of this will go. In a moment, I will introduce my distinguished co-editors, David Slucki and Gabriel N, and give them a chance to speak about the book. And we will also have almost all of our contributors to the volume, who I will introduce after David and Gabi speak, and each of them will have a chance to speak about their contributions to the book. And we will leave time for some Q&A at the end of the program. And how will this work? I'm glad that you asked. As the audience will be muted, questions can be asked in the chat box. So you can access the chat box by hovering over the bottom of your screen. You can click on chat and ask your questions directed to everyone, not in a direct message to someone, but if you click it and share it to everyone, then they'll be able to read it, and we'll try to respond to the questions. And if you have a question that you wanted to respond to direct to someone specific, please state that in the question line. Now, I'll say one caveat: we are trying to keep the event to approximately 1 hour. So if we go over that, we may not get to answer all questions. So now, without further ado, it is großen COVID, and it feels weird to say that in these times, but it's still a great honor to introduce the volume editors, my co-editors, David Slucki and Gabi N. David Slucki is the Lodis Margon Associate Professor of Contemporary Jewish Life and Culture at the Australian Center for Jewish Civilization at Monash University, and author of Sing This at My Funeral, a memoir of fathers and sons, which was published by Wayne State in 2019. And Gabi N is professor in the Department of Germanic Languages and Literatures and former director of the Jewish Studies program at the University of Virginia, and co-editor of Jewish Honor Courts, Revenge, Retribution, and Reconciliation in Europe and Israel After the Holocaust, published by Wayne State in 2015. So I'm going to turn it over to David, who is speaking to us from the future, 14 hours ahead in Melbourne in Australia, where by all accounts, the coronavirus is still in existence in the future. And he's also at Tom's Diner on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. So David, go ahead, take it away.
Matt Monk's Avi Monksteiner,
Sorry.
the fictional version. We should also, I also want to give a plug to Avi and to your wonderful work, as Gabby and I got nice introductions. So I will return the favor and say Avi is the Doris and Simon Conover Professor of Judaic Studies and the Director of the Center for Jewish Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life at the University of Connecticut. And his list of books is ever growing, including an upcoming volume on the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and remembrance of that event. So I guess I just want to talk for a couple of minutes and give a bit of a sense of the genesis of the book, where it came from, and a bit of a sense of the kind of main thrust of what we tried to put together with all the chapters. The book was born at a conference in 2016 at Brandeis University on Lenny Bruce, actually. And at the time, Avi and Gabby and I were sort of like had a bit of a traveling roadshow going, where we would present, the three of us, at conferences either on comedy or on the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. It was a kind of strange couple of things that we had going on. And we were presenting a session on humor after the Holocaust. And at one of the coffee breaks, the three of us said, why don't we put together a book on this? We know a bunch of people doing great work on the topic. So there's a bunch of people at that conference and a bunch of other people that are sort of in our networks, in our spheres. So we reached out to a bunch of people. We reached out to Wayne State, who have just been tremendously supportive the whole way. And the book came together, I would say, reasonably quickly. That's, it's sort of just over 3 years, maybe 3.5 years since we had the first conversation about it. And it's been extraordinarily humbling to work with such an amazing array of scholars and writers who have just contributed really like interesting, thought-provoking and challenging work and ideas around how we think about and remember the Holocaust. So that's really the thrust of the book, is how do we remember the Holocaust? Where is the kind of, what are the kind of limits of representation, and where does humor fit into that? So really, I think pretty much all the contributors, and I'm not going to talk about specific chapters because everyone will talk about their own chapters, but the thrust of the book is that humor after the Holocaust is possible. We took the famous misinterpreted maxim of Theodor Adorno as our kind of jumping off point, that is to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. And in which he's not saying that you can't write poetry after Auschwitz, he's saying that what it means to write poetry changes with the knowledge of the Holocaust. And what we're saying, I think, across all the chapters, is that humor means something different in light of the Holocaust. And it's not something that we can ignore or avoid. It's part of how humans get by day to day, how we interact with each other. But humor is a central, and it's a central part of how we interact. And so we have to come to terms with what it means when we're talking about the Holocaust and thinking about humor as a lens through which to understand that difficult past. So we brought together, our idea was to bring together a range of contributors that covered different geographic and historical moments and places. So we have contributors from Europe, the Americas, Australia, Israel. It's not a complete history of this topic. There's still much more work to be done in all those areas. We'd love to see what people write about humor in Poland, for example. There's more to be said about humor in Germany. But this is like a really good jumping off point, I think, if people want to have a clear sense of like, what are the key ethical, moral, aesthetic questions that we need to ask when talking about humor after the Holocaust. I'll talk a little more later about my own chapter and where my sort of thinking came from with all this, but I think that's probably a good jumping off point. Gabby?
Thanks. Once again, I want to thank my co-editors, David and Avi. We really we were close friends before this began. We're even closer now. It's been such a pleasure to work with them and also to work with Wayne State, which has been supportive all the way. Kathy Wildfong, Annie Martin, and the entire staff, thank you so much. And we have wonderful contributors. And together, I think that we've created an extremely interesting, thought-provoking book. I would like to say a few words about humor. You know, when we started this project, I had some doubts myself. A lot of people in the background, and I wasn't sure whether I liked the idea of humor in the Holocaust, but I came to understand through the process of working with Avi and David and working in my own chapter, which I'll discuss a little bit later, and reading the other chapters, that humor is undeniably and perhaps inevitably part of the Holocaust memorial landscape. The part, I think that's due because of the temporal distance from the event, from the Holocaust. But the truth of the matter is that humor has always been part of the way in which survivors and non-survivors affected by the Holocaust have made sense of the Holocaust and have remembered it. I have some of my cousins here. My children are surrounding me here in the kitchen. I'm the child of Holocaust survivors, and I grew up in a home of jokes. So it was one way to make sense of what happened. Even the survivors, I grew up with these things. So I know that it's true that the Holocaust, that humor is one prism among many in which the Holocaust has been refracted by survivors and then by subsequent generations like us. And I've also come to understand in a way that I didn't understand at the beginning of our project, that humor is perhaps a more honest way of understanding and thinking about the Holocaust and other more conventional or respectable ways of thinking about it. As we point out in our introduction, because unlike other conventional ways, humorous representations of the Holocaust make no pretensions about depicting it in a realistic or hyper-realistic style. Humor, by its very nature, to borrow from philosopher Slavoj Žižek, accepts in advance its innate and ultimate failure to faithfully represent the Holocaust. So therefore, when we use humor, we're being honest about the way that we represent it. We're not saying that we're trying to represent it realistically, we're trying to understand it. So therefore, humor is a current fixture in the memorial landscape of the Holocaust. But it's very important to remember that we, the co-editors and contributors to the volume, we're just acknowledging this fact. We're describing political, social, and cultural functions in various countries in which humor is used to criticize society, culture, politics, but we do this in an analytical way, and we do it while analyzing the evolving boundaries of humor. So it's important to keep in mind that the Holocaust itself is not the butt of the joke. The Holocaust is being deployed by humorists and comedians to level criticism of political, social, and cultural values and mores. And as far as the boundaries are concerned, we don't prescribe in the book what's legitimate or illegitimate to say or portray within these boundaries. We analyze. All of us are asking what the boundaries have been, what they are, and the direction where they seem to be going. So while the very subject of the book may seem provocative to some readers, in the end, we hope that all readers, survivors and readers who are not survivors, regardless of age, origins, citizenship, and political orientation, will find the book's essays thoughtful and thought-provoking. Thank you. Those are my comments for now.
Can I just add something before we continue on? And that is that between Avi, Gabi, and I, we all have very different senses of humor. And so there was a lot of back and forth about what types of humor to include, what each of us considered funny. And, you know, that we had some robust discussions throughout about that. And I think like that's part of what we really hope the volume brings to people, that it covers all different genres and styles of humor, and that people will probably and hopefully feel uncomfortable in places because there's going to be things that they see as beyond a boundary that maybe others don't.
Right. And I think to pick up on that, it shows that humor is by itself very subjective. So what one finds amusing, another finds offensive. And that's exactly one of the things that we want to probe and explore. And David pointed out in the introduction, we launch off with the idea that we're at a point almost 25 years after Life is Beautiful, which at the time was sort of seemed like a turning point, very provocative film, very controversial. Viewed with the perspective of time, right, it seems kind of quaint in a sense, especially in living in a time where we're seeing even more and more invocations of humor as relates to the Holocaust, especially here we are 75 years after liberation. We think about the passing of the survivor generation, the last living eyewitnesses, and we think about more and more uses of humor as a way of representing the Holocaust, and it makes us both uneasy, but at the same time is something that needs to be analyzed and examined. Now, what I'm going to do, I'd like to share my screen here so you can see the table of contents. Hopefully you can see it there. And one of the things that you'll see in terms of the contributors to the volume is, as we've pointed out, we sort of have this international group of presenters who also represent really a global approach to the uses of humor and the sort of question of humor in the Holocaust. And so we're going to proceed with the contributors who are here on the call in the order that it's listed in the table of contents, and you'll get a sense for sort of the orientation that they each bring and the different perspectives to humor that is presented both during and after the war, and then humor that it's a much more recent sort of reflection on the Holocaust as well, much more contemporary. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, our first presenter, and these will be brief, sort of give you just a little bit of a Vorspeise of what's in the chapter, and hopefully encourage you to read further. So our first contributor who's here with us on the call is Anna Shternshis, and Anna holds the position of Al and Malka Green Professor of Yiddish Studies and is the director of the Anne Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Toronto. She's the author of Soviet and Kosher, Jewish Popular Culture in the Soviet Union, 1923 to 1939, and a great title, When Sonia Met Boris, An Oral History of Jewish Life under Stalin. And together with artist Psoy Korolenko, she created a Grammy-nominated, the Grammy-nominated Yiddish Glory Project, the initiative that brought back to life the forgotten Yiddish music written during the Holocaust in the Soviet Union. And I can also say, breaking news, she's also a recent recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, which is just amazing. So I'm happy to hand over the screen to Anna Shternshis, speaking on Hitler Hanging on the Tree, Humor and Violence in Soviet Yiddish Folklore of World War II. Anna.
Hi. Thank you, Avi, for this wonderful introduction. And honestly, so great to see you all in your apartments. And, it's adds something to, I don't know, it's hard to be on distance, but it's a strangely intimate experience that we get to see where we all sit and what's on the background and all this. So I'm very excited to be part of this conversation. So my chapter deals with the very early post-Holocaust experience. I would even say that Soviet Jews, Soviet Yiddish speakers started laughing at Hitler before the war was over. In fact, we had a discussion with editors whether or not my chapter actually fits into the volume that's called Laughter After the Holocaust, whereas the earliest jokes about Hitler, about the German army, and about fascism in general, and even some jokes about Holocaust appear as early as 1941 in my specific material. So the chapter is based on Yiddish songs and jokes and humor songs collected by a group of Soviet Jewish ethnomusicologists and folklorists in the Soviet Union during the war itself, between 1941 and 1945, and a little bit after the war from 1945 to 1948. And a large chunk of this material comes from places that were away from the actual war zone, especially early on, such as Kazakhstan, and some from Uzbekistan. In fact, I start my chapter by saying that one of the journalists, Herschel Blostein, who spent the war in Kazakhstan, wrote an article about jokes that he was collecting there among Polish Jewish refugees. And he said in his op-ed that he was submitting to a Soviet Yiddish newspaper, Enikei, that 1943 will be remembered in Jewish history as the year when Jewish humor flourished. And he went on to prove his claim by showing how many jokes, how funny and how
I think Anna might be frozen. Yes. Okay.
Yep, she's frozen.
Okay. So we will, hopefully when she comes back, we'll bring her back onto the call. So in the meantime, I'll move to our next speaker, and David, you'll let me know when Anna comes back in, okay?
Yeah, and Emily
I will.
do that. She's
I'm watching.
Okay, thank you. So, so the next chapter that appears after Anna's chapter, which looks at Soviet Yiddish folklore really during the war itself, is a chapter by Marc Caplan. And Marc is currently a visiting professor at the Taubi Department of Jewish Studies at the University of Wrocław in Poland. His second book, Yiddish Writers in Weimar Berlin, A Fugitive Modernism, is forthcoming from Indiana University Press. And the title of his chapter is Too Soon, Yiddish Humor and the Holocaust in Post-War Poland. So go ahead, Marc.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to begin by thanking Gabriel and Avinoam and David for the invitation to participate in this volume. It's a great honor, and it's great working with all three of you. You've been terrific, tremendous, really supportive and constructive editors throughout this project. So that has been a real delight. A little bit of late breaking news of my own. Next year, I just signed a contract last week. I will be a visiting professor at Dartmouth College. So I'm looking forward to that as another position from which to transmit my work. And again, my book on Yiddish in the Weimar era should be forthcoming in the fall. What I wrote about for this collection, and this was really David and Avinoam and Gabriel's invitation to do so, were a couple of Yiddish language cultural productions made immediately after the war in Poland, in a very unstable time as Poland is going from liberation to a new sort of occupation under Soviet authority. David had first approached me by email asking me to write about a collection by Moshe Nudelman called Gelächter durch Tränen, Laughter Through Tears, which is a collection of feuilletons that Nudelman had published in 1947. And I said, you know, that's a great work. I'd like to write about it, but I don't know if I can get really a whole article about it. I've always wanted to write about the film Unsere Kinder, which was also made in Poland at the very same time. And there were two facts that I learned very quickly about that. And one is that Gabriel and Avi both have written very extensively about Unsere Kinder before me. I didn't know that at the time. I never would have had the chutzpah to volunteer that as a topic. But I must say that I learned tremendously from their research. And it certainly deepened my understanding and my appreciation of the movie. And I hope my contribution resonates with what they have already written about it. But the other fact that I quickly discovered upon embarking on my research is that Moshe Nudelman wrote for Jigen and Schumacher, who are the stars of the film Unsere Kinder. So I guess I should have realized this before I began my comparison of the two works. But again, the integral nature of the way these artistic networks, which had functioned, which were already in place before the war, and which reconstitute themselves very briefly in Poland after the war, for about 18 months after the war, and then continue to collaborate as an international network of Yiddish cultural performance, Yiddish theater, Yiddish comedy, really until the end of the life of these respective figures is really, really remarkable. And in a sense, that is as much the topic of the article that I write about as the specific cultural works that I focus on, Nudelman's book of feuilleton and Jigen and Schumacher's film, Unsere Kinder. If I may, I'd like to read an excerpt of what I've written that talks about Jigen and Schumacher's career as specifically identified post-Holocaust Yiddish performers in Israel. And one of the things that, again, I discovered, maybe this is common knowledge to other scholars of the field, Moshe Nudelman continued to write for them from the United States while they were working in Israel. So I'm going to write about specifically, or I'm going to read to you specifically about Jigen's post-war, post-Schumacher career. This is toward the end of my article. There's plenty more. I'm not giving away the whole story here. But I focus specifically on a monologue that Jigen recorded in the early 1960s called Yankel der Katziv, Yankel the Butcher, which illustrates some of the same paradoxes that Moshe Nudelman's work had underscored in the immediate post-war era. The butcher, who relates his life story in the recording, has opened his shop on Dizengoff Street, the main street in Tel Aviv, using reparations money from Germany. And he applies for the funds at his wife's insistence because, as she reasons, if people who had suffered under the Germans don't want to accept their reparations, that's their business. But you have nothing to be ashamed of since you were in Russia the entire time. This reiterates the most frequent jokes in Nudelman's post-Holocaust collection of Jews trying to work the system for personal gain, and of everyday life shaped not by the traumas of the war years, but by the absurdity and banality of post-war bureaucracy. As Yankel explains, every aspect of his life is guided by his wife's vision. She took him out of the meat locker to open the business. She led him to the wedding canopy, and had even given birth to 2 children all by herself. I had nothing to do with it. So too was it her idea to take a trip to Europe. But rather than seeking out places of memory for Yiddish-speaking Jews, sites closed off by the Cold War, they traveled to England, to France, and to Switzerland. The Europe they encounter is therefore a de-Judaized space, even if Yankel can only understand it from a perspective shaped by his experiences as a Yiddish speaker and as an Israeli. Paris, accordingly, is a city just like any other city, a dirty city with dirty streets. Everyone there has dirty hands. In Israel, that would be impossible, because in Israel, one hand washes the other. Mm-hmm. When his wife brings him to the Louvre, Yankel remembers that he's heard of it, but he can't remember if it's a kosher butcher shop or if it was the synagogue where Rothschild heard Kol Nidre. Despite seeing Paris through Jewish eyes, Yankel's vocabulary is so limited that at every meal, he is only able to order a single dish, filet mignon, a conspicuously non-kosher cut of meat. This suggests that something is similarly less than kosher about the butcher himself, and the suspicion is confirmed when Yankel returns to Israel from Switzerland. While going through customs, he insists that his wife not be searched or questioned because she is in a state of advanced pregnancy. The customs officer takes her away, however, and returns to offer Yankel congratulations. His wife has just given birth to septuplets, 7 yards of silk fabric. Unfortunately, the officer adds, it was a difficult birth and she had to be delivered by C-section. The entire journey thus serves as a vehicle for further satirizing daily life in Israel, particularly the pervasiveness of its bureaucracy and its taxes. Yankel is a typical Israeli, but only by virtue of his status as a disempowered outsider. Linguistically and culturally, he is still a refugee and immigrant, regardless of how many years he has lived in Israel. And I'm going to conclude with the last paragraph of my essay right now. Paradoxically, however, the status that Jigen and Schumacher perform as outsiders and new olim, and their exclusive use of Yiddish on stage account for their stardom in the new state of Israel. As John Ephron makes clear in his study of Jigen and Schumacher, their arrival in Israel in 1950 occasioned a lengthy and glowing article in Devar, which, while not fully appreciating the difficulties they faced, nonetheless fully understood what megastars the duo were and what their presence in Israel meant for the Yiddish-speaking public and Israeli theater in general. Jigin's acclaim in Israel depended on the ability to present himself as an outsider to the new national consciousness, for which Yiddish remained as marginal and powerless as it had been previously in interwar Poland. Such celebrity status, however, could only have developed in a Jewish state during an era when virtually every citizen had been born elsewhere, and the vast majority of those places of origin had been Yiddish-speaking spaces destroyed by the Holocaust. The ability to mock the new society and the murdered language constituted both an act of commemoration for the past and a statement of defiance toward the present. What Jigin and Schumacher demonstrate in this gesture, with frequent help from Noodleman's writings, is the force that unites their comic energy with subsequent generations of Jewish humor referencing the Holocaust, that humor can function as a weapon of resistance. What Noodleman had described as Witzgewehr, jokes as weapons, and it is in the hands of the marginalized that this weapon cuts sharpest and deepest.
All right, thank you, Marc. So I see that Anna is back. Yeah, so Anna, I just want to give you a chance to wrap up your talk about your chapter before we continue. Are you there?
Thank you. I'm sorry about that. I am here on two screens just because, I don't know, maybe one day there will be a joke about this, and I have to say that I did start collecting COVID-19 jokes. It's already like a long list of stuff, but it will be something to think about later. So anyways, so I think I more or less spoke what I wanted to say. The only thing I want to say, kind of the big argument that I was making in that chapter, is that what was interesting to me is, what do people find funny in 1943 when they're stuck in Kazakhstan? What do people find funny in ghettos in central Ukraine? And what do historians and folklorists who record these jokes find relevant and important for them to preserve for history? And I was also interested in how all this works in the conditions of a totalitarian society, which Stalin's Soviet Union was. So on one hand, people are laughing at Hitler, and that's completely acceptable in a public space. And yet Soviet censors are so busy checking, are they laughing at Hitler in a correct manner? In other words, if they're laughing at people who are collaborating with the German army, are these people Ukrainians? Because you cannot laugh at Soviet collaborators with German army, because according to Soviet narrative, there's no such thing as Soviet collaborators. So there's tension between laughter as a weapon and also laughter as something subversive that has to be controlled by the Soviet government, and also how it all works in Yiddish was really interesting to me. And also the fact that, I found all these jokes in Soviet archives in the early 2000s, and none of them survived in popular memory, not one. And to me, that was a story of humor that's so cute, that's so relevant to the present, maybe used as a weapon, maybe used as, as a distraction, maybe used as just something, maybe just circulating something, but something that does not end up in popular memory. And that the story of history and memory, telling completely different stories and preserving all that in Yiddish, is something where I thought humor would be really interesting and useful to look at. So that's the content of my chapter. And I made it without internet dying immediately. So I feel like it's a huge accomplishment. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Anna. And thank you again to Marc. So we'll continue with our next presenter, now moving from Soviet representations to sort of post-war Poland and satires both of Israel and Poland to look at the case of Lynn Jaldaty. So David Schneer, there's David. David is a writer and teacher and serves as the Louis P. Singer Chair in Jewish History and Professor of Jewish Studies at the University of Colorado. His award-winning works include Yiddish and the Creation of Soviet Jewish Culture, Through Soviet Eyes, Photography, War, and the Holocaust, published by Rutgers in 2011, and Grief, the Biography of a Holocaust Photograph, published by Oxford, forthcoming in 2020. And his chapter in the volume is Is it still funny? Lynn Jaldati and Yiddish satire before and after the Holocaust. So it's a pleasure to turn it over to David Schneer.
So thank you. And it's Lynn Jaldati with a
Sorry.
Y as opposed
Yeah.
to a J. So first, thank you to Avi, to Gabi, and to David for inviting me to participate in this. I actually really struggled with whether I thought she was funny, whether I thought this Lynn Jaldati, a Dutch Jewish dancer and singer who survived Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen and sang anti-fascist Yiddish songs, would actually be funny. And I actually learned that she was. So she sang anti-fascist Yiddish songs and made her way to the German Democratic Republic to be with her husband, Eberhard Raibling, and their two daughters to become the Yiddish diva of the communist world. And I wrote an article for Laughter After about her song, How Did the Tsar Drink His Tea? Wie soll trinkt der Kaiser Tee? Otherwise known as Gentlemen. So before the war, they had a bit of feisty Yiddish indigenous satire that poked fun at the Tsar, at rabbis, at anyone in power. But after the war, I wondered what it had to say when she sang it in 1960s East Berlin or in 1980s Amsterdam. I'm going to read the last paragraph just to sum up how I relate to Jaldati's humor. So this was after I talk about the 85 Amsterdam concert where she sang How Does the Tsar Drink His Tea? And there was laughter on the radio, on the sound recording. So the question remains, what was the Dutch audience laughing at? Was it at the empathetic fears of people living under an autocracy in the past? Probably not. Potential fear of contemporary right-wing politicians taking power in the 1980s? Remember, this is the era of Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, Helmut Kohl, and in the Netherlands, Ruud Lubbers, who championed similar privatization policies as the others. Or might the audience have been poking fun at Jews by laughing at Jaldati's rendition of the Yiddish language itself, which evoked romanticized lost worlds and quaint extinct cultures? No matter the answer, in 1980s Amsterdam, Jaldati and her audience may have resurrected the original satire in Rabo Sire, Gentlemen, which as she and her daughter rendered it, added a new layer of meaning to the song, even to the song. Even though it remained a memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, Gentlemen had a new overlay of broad political satire. And if Jaldati were to sing the song today, how would it resonate with the audience who would laugh at images of the emperor, read Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, Recep Erdogan, or Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, and his ostentatiousness as he licks and licks and licks at the mound of sugar? And so I was going to end this with singing a rendition of the song Wie soll trinkt der Kaiser Tee, or How Does the Tsar Drink His Tea? And so it's 3 lines. And so the first one basically says, I have a question to ask. How does the Tsar drink his tea? He takes a hat full of sugar. One puts a hole inside and one pours hot water inside and licks and licks and licks. Gentlemen, I'd like to ask a question. How does the Tsar eat his potatoes? One takes a wall full of butter, and one takes a potato and puts it inside, and one shoots the potato through the Tsar's into the Tsar's mouth. Gentlemen, I'd like to ask a question. How does the Tsar sleep? One takes a room full of feathers, one shoves the Tsar inside, and a regiment spends the entire night screaming at the top of his lungs, "Shh, the Tsar is sleeping." So I'm just going to sing the first stanza for you guys, and then I'll wrap up. Rabosai, Rabosai, Chachomim on a bread. Ich will euch etwas fragen, ich will euch etwas fragen. Frag schon, frag. Entfernt mir alle auf mein Scheile. Wie soll trinkt der Kaiser Tee? Man nimmt der Hitler Zicker und man macht da rein ein Lächle und man gießt da raus heiß Wasser und der Kaiser beschulem leckt. Otazoi, trinkt der Kaiser Tee. That's the end.
Nice, David. Thank you so much. So now all the subsequent contributors just have to sing. So no pressure. So to continue, the next section of the book moves on from the aftermath of the war and sort of questions that look on the boundaries of using humor to remember the Holocaust in the aftermath of the war, to the question of breaking taboos and using humor to challenge what is taboo and what is appropriate and inappropriate. And you can see, so Jenny Caplan, before I introduce her, you'll see who her subject is on the screen behind her, who is the ultimate breaker of taboos. She'll be speaking on Lenny Bruce a bit. So to introduce Jennifer Caplan is an assistant professor of religious studies and the program director for undergraduate Jewish studies at Towson University. Her book, All Joking Aside, Judaism and Humor from the Borscht Belt to Broad City, is forthcoming from Wayne State University Press. And the title of her chapter in the book is Nebishes, New Jews and Humor, The Changing Image of American Jewish Masculinity Post-Holocaust. Go ahead, Jenny.
Thanks, Avi. And I will echo what everybody else said. Thank you to Avi and David and Gabby. I was at the Lenny Bruce conference 3 years ago, and so I have been excited to be part of this project and to have seen where it came from. So my chapter is a little bit different than what came before it in the book, because I'm dealing with the Holocaust kind of conceptually more than in real terms, because my chapter looks at the impact not so much of the Holocaust itself on American Jews, but of the narrative around the Holocaust, specifically the narrative around Jews as victims and what that did to images of Jewish masculinity. So I sort of look at this moment in the early second half of the 20th century, the 1950s and 1960s, after the war, when you had these competing ideas of what Jewish masculinity might become. And sort of on one far extreme, you had the Ari Ben Canaan Exodus superhero Jew that was obviously unattainable for anybody. That, you know, he was too perfect. He was too Paul Newman. That was never going to happen. And then the sort of next step over, you had what Norman Mailer called the white Negro, and identified as this hipster figure that I identify Lenny Bruce as an example of. And these were people who were very anti-establishment, sort of aggressive, in your face, interested in urban culture and adopting a particular kind of tough exterior. And so that's sort of like one option that existed in this moment. And then the other option I work with, whose picture I didn't put behind me because I didn't want to look at his face, is Woody Allen. So you have this like warring moment in the 1960s when the images of Jewish masculinity and humor could go in the direction of Lenny Bruce, in this more aggressive, violent, in-your-face kind of way, or it could go in the direction of Woody Allen in the nebbish, sort of less physically aggressive, more intellectual model. And so kind of what I work with over the course of the chapter is why it actually ended up being the nebbish that won that battle. What some of the reasons around taking on the seemingly less, I don't know, well, anyway, the less nice version, the one that makes people seem a little bit weaker and less physically intimidating. So that's where my chapter is sitting in terms of its relationship to the Holocaust. It's really looking at what the Holocaust did psychologically to American Jews, and particularly the images around American Jewish masculinity. So I'm not going to sing anything. And yeah, I hope that you all enjoy the book.
Great. All right. Thank you, Jenny. And I want to mention that Jenny and Jarrod hosted probably one of the last conferences that took place before the everything got shut down by the coronavirus, which was a wonderful conference at UNC Wilmington called the No Respect Conference on Jewish Humor. And so with that segue, I'm happy to turn it over to Jarrod Tanny, who is Associate Professor of History and the Charles and Hannah Block Distinguished Scholar in Jewish History at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. And he's written multiple volumes, including a monograph, City of Rogues and Schnorrers, which looks at Jewish life in the city of Odessa, mythologized as a city of sin. And he is currently working on a larger study on Jewish humor in post-World War II America and its place within the larger context of the European Jewish past. So Jarrod will be speaking on his chapter, quote, "We're safe here, but Poland is a state of mind," unquote, the exploitation of Holocaust consciousness in Jewish fiction and memoirs. Go ahead, Jarrod Tanny. And you just have to unmute yourself, Jarrod.
Can anyone hear me?
You're on.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. I'm sorry that I was typing too loud before my mother got disconnected. I was trying to help her get back online. And thank you so much, Avi, for that introduction. And thank you so much to Avi, Gabby, and David. I will echo the adulations that everyone has put forth for this absolutely wonderful volume. I was also at the Lenny Bruce conference where this volume had its inception, and I was thrilled to be asked to participate in it. And thank you, Avi, for mentioning the conference that we just had in Wilmington, literally days before everything got shut down because of the pandemic. And Jenny and I were not even remotely responsible for everything getting subsequently shut down, at least as far as I know. So I'll talk a little bit about my chapter just for a few minutes, and I'll read a small portion of it. And I look, as the title suggested, how Holocaust consciousness and Holocaust memory is exploited in Jewish literature and memoirs. So some of it's fiction, some of it's not fiction. A large percentage of the authors are American, but I also look at some European authors like the British novelist Howard Jacobson, the French Jewish novelist Romain Gary, Tuvia Tannenbaum, who is a German-American. Of course, I need to throw in a couple of Canadians, Mordechai Richler and S. Hanala Stadner, and Gary Steingart, the Russian-American Jewish novelist. But I'm just going to focus my remarks now on one portion of the essay in which I look at Shalom Auslander's novel, Hope, a Tragedy. And in this novel, Shalom Auslander's protagonist, his principal character, is a 21st century Jewish Schlemazel who discovers that an elderly Anne Frank, who is in fact a miserable, obnoxious, foul-mouthed, self-entitled survivor, is actually living in his attic in 2010 in upstate New York. Now, the Anne in this novel is very bitter. Why is she bitter? Because her diary became very successful while she was believed to be dead. And the fact that when some 50 odd years earlier, she came out to the volume's publisher, "Hey, I'm alive," and the publisher told her to stay dead and that she would do much better if she remains among the dead, and her book would stop selling immediately as she came out. So hence her bitterness, hence her moving from attic to attic throughout the novel, and hence her ending up in Shalom Auslander's main character's attic in upstate New York. Now, she does have one moment of clarity where she says something very profound about Holocaust memory, and she explains her position on it, and by implication, the deification of the diary's version of Anne Frank. And I quote, "I think never forgetting the Holocaust is not the same thing as never shutting up about it." Now, Anne Frank here is echoing a point made by the historian Alvin Rosenfeld on the oversaturation of Holocaust memory. Rosenfeld insists that the very success of the Holocaust's wide dissemination in the public sphere can work to undermine its gravity and render it a more familiar thing. Made increasingly familiar through repetition, it becomes normalized. Now, on the surface, it may seem as if Holocaust humor is contributing to this normalization by mocking the sacred, by trivializing the horror, by exploiting the memory. But what I argue in my essay is that well-crafted Holocaust humor interrogates the ways in which we have chosen to commemorate atrocity and what impact such commemoration has on survivors, their children, and the Jewish community as a whole. So I argue that Holocaust humor destabilizes the standard narrative we receive through historiography, documentaries, and monuments. It's an alternative lens through which we can understand one of the greatest catastrophes of the 20th century. Humor, in this sense, forces us to think seriously about genocide. Now, I'd like to quote from Shalom Auslander's book. I think is one of the funniest passages. It's pretty dark, and as all three editors have very different senses of humor, perhaps I suspect that maybe one of the editors found it funny and maybe one of the other editors didn't. But indeed, it is one of the funniest passages in the book, I think. And the passage takes place earlier in the novel, before Anne Frank actually made her appearance. Now, the main character, Solomon Kugel, is brought up in New York, thinking that his mother was in fact a Holocaust survivor. But the reality was that she had been born in Brooklyn in 1945. So once when Kugel was 8 years old, his mother came to his bedroom with a picture book and a lampshade. And I quote, "She brushed the hair from his brow and told him that it was time to learn, that he learned about a terrible place known as Buchenwald. Flipping through the book, which was called The Holocaust, she showed him photo after photo of mass graves, starved prisoners, piles of naked corpses. And she said, 'That's your uncle. That's your grandfather's sister. That's your cousin's father.' Perplexed yet inquisitive, Kugel asked her why she brought him a lampshade. And I quote, 'That,' she said with a sigh, 'that is your grandfather.' Then she buried her face in her hands and wept. Kugel held the lampshade in his hands and turned it over. And then he asked, 'This is Zadie?' Mother nodded and composed herself. 'You see what they do to us? There's no peace, no peace. Wherever we go, wherever we hide, terror and more terror and more terror.' 'But,' Kugel responded, 'but it says made in Taiwan.' Mother looked at him, disappointment and anger in her tear-stained eyes. 'Well, they're not going to write made in Buchenwald, are they?' But even after he learned the truth, Kugel decided to humor his mother. Why? Because he realized that she had co-opted the trauma into her identity to help her cope with her husband's abandonment of their family. And I quote Auslander's narrator again. She seemed to need the war, and he was pleased to be able to give it to her. At last, there was something other than hate that young Kugel could give the mother he so adored. He could give her suffering. Now, unfortunately, Kugel did not know what he was in for, because then he discovered Anne Frank living in his attic. And evicting Anne Frank from your attic is actually much harder than one might suppose it to be. At least that's the case for the remainder of the novel. And I won't spoil any more about it. So that's it. Thank you so much. I'm very happy to share my work with you. Thank you.
Nicely done, Jarrod. And I do want to point out that that is a real picture of Jarrod with the fawns behind him, Henry Winkler. So, and it is a nice segue from Anne Frank, who, as we see in numerous cases, continues to grow in popularity in terms of her invocations in Holocaust humor in many ways. And our next presenter, Liat Steir Livny, who is joining us at 2:56 in the morning in Israel, and we owe her gratitude for staying up for this. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Cultural Studies, Creation and Production at Sapir College, and a tutor and course coordinator for Cultural Studies Master's Program in the Department of Literature, Language, and Arts at the Open University of Israel. She has authored numerous articles and 5 books, including Is It Okay to Laugh About It? Holocaust Humor, Satire, and Parody in Israeli Culture. Her chapter in this volume is The Image of Anne Frank, from Universal Hero to Comic Figure. Liat.
Hi, thanks. Thank you. Hi, everyone. And thanks, the editors. Yes, it's 3 o'clock in the morning here. My daughters are still up, of course, because of the coronavirus. They completely changed their timetable. Now they're watching reruns of Friends. So while they're watching, let me just please share a screen. Can you just tell me if you can see it? Yeah, everybody can see it? Okay.
Yes.
So this is my chapter. It deals with the image of Anne Frank, from Universal Hero to Comic Figure. And of course, I don't have to introduce Anne Frank. We all know the story, the writing of the diary, her hiding in the attic, and the fact that she and her sister perished, their mother as well. Otto Frank, the father, was the only one who survived, went back to Amsterdam, got the diary, published it, and what became a worldwide success in the 1950s. Now, although canonic collective agents continued to deal with her as a myth, and she became a myth from the 50s onwards, a new subversive path of remembrance has developed, especially in the last 2 decades, that breaks the sanctity of the image by using humor, satire, and parody. Now, scholars have worked on or analyzed examples of Anne Frank humor in English from American, Australian, and global internet popular culture, and they reveal that they mainly deconstruct the sacredness of the Anne Frank myth. They deconstruct the myth in a poke the bear kind of way. And I'm just gonna introduce some examples here. Jarrod talked about Shalom Oslander's novel, his great novel, but before him, the one who preceded him was the greatest Philip Roth with The Ghostwriter. You can find it on American sitcoms and animation sitcoms like South Park comedy, South Park, and Robot Chicken, Family Guy, and so on. And you, of course, can find it online. Now, let me just remind you what our honorable editors have just said about people may find it funny, others may find it inconvenient. And here you can find some examples from the famous Anne Frank meme online, where you can see her picture and with funny or unfunny subtitles like play hide and seek, sure, count me in. I love the readers, but they're so loud. You can party, but you should be very quiet. And there are others like knock, knock, who's there? Oh, I don't want to say the F word, and so on. And these are really the light ones, because there are really much darker ones, but I don't want to get into it right now. My article deals with Anne Frank humor in Israel, and I opposed to humor in the Western world like I've described right now. Israeli Anne Frank humor is much deeper. It's much deeper than deconstruction of the myth. It reflects ongoing debates about several themes, prominent themes, in Israeli Holocaust commemoration, and these are the subtitles of the article. I show in my article how Anne Frank humor in Israel ridicules the acting out of the Holocaust in Israeli everyday life. It fights religious explanations of the Holocaust. It satirizes Holocaust dark tourism. It addresses the ethnic problematic aspects of Holocaust commemoration, and it ridicules the right-wing politicization of the Holocaust. And of course, I don't have time here to get into each and every one of the examples. I'll just give you one example. So my research indicates that Holocaust awareness in Israel is very intense. Israel is a unique sphere when it comes to Holocaust awareness. Research indicates that Israeli media, educational and cultural field, and public discourse all frame the Holocaust as a current ongoing local trauma rather than an event that ended decades ago in another place. Now, I've collected examples from social media, especially from Twitter. I have ample examples. I didn't use all of them in the article, but most of them, to show that the Israeli web users don't mock Anne Frank while using her in their tweets, but they mock themselves. They describe their daily lives by using Anne Frank's characters. And it shows how deeply the Holocaust is rooted within their identity, but in another sense, it fights what our collective memory agents are doing, because it's deconstructing the fear factor. And I can give you a couple of examples, and again, I have ample examples. Let's say family relations, and these are all tweets, recent tweets. I'm in a family gathering, the levels of anxiety I experience. Here you see similar the moment Anne Frank was captured, and Anne Frank was, we're talking about self-criticism. Anne Frank was 13 when she wrote her entire diary. I'm 26 and I've already spilled 2 cups of coffee on myself today. And of course, my favorite, it deals with desperate moms. If I'd write a diary about my mental state 2 weeks before the summer vacation is over, it would be sadder than the Anne Frank diary. So you can see that the point of laughter is completely different. This is us we're laughing about. This is self-deprecating humor in which Israeli Jews laugh about themselves while using Anne Frank humor. And again, this goes to show, first of all, how deeply the Holocaust is rooted within Israeli Jews' identity, because these are all people in their 20s, in their 30s. This is 3rd generation, 4th generation after the Holocaust. But most of all, this is kind of a grassroots rebel against what our collective memory agents are doing. It has much deeper political, cultural, and social sense of rebellion than just the construction of the myth. So thank you very much, and I hope you buy the book and read it. Thank you.
Toda rabba, Liat. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I think you raise a lot of interesting points, and we can think about sort of the analogs that we might find people making today in comparisons to sort of life in hiding and shelter today, which we can think about as well.
Yeah, I'm collecting them. You can find many analogs.
I'm sure
right?
People are tweeting about it right now, right and left. So, so I want to segue to one of our editors, Gabi Finder, whose chapter comes next in the volume, and looks at the case of a German Jewish comedian by the name of Oliver Pollock. The chapter is "I'm Allowed, I'm a Jew: Oliver Pollock and Jewish Humor in Contemporary Germany After the Holocaust." Go ahead, Gabi.
Thank you, Avi. I'll be short because it's already after 8 o'clock. Oliver Pollock was born in Germany in 1976, and he's the son of a Holocaust survivor. And he's arguably Germany's most popular stand-up comedian. And in my chapter, I analyzed two of Pollock's comedic acts. One is called "I'm Allowed, I'm a Jew," in German, "Ich darf es, ich bin Jude." And the other in English translation is "Let's all be Jews, lasst uns alle Juden sein." And the Holocaust figures prominently in Pollock's first act and is the backdrop to the second. And in my chapter, I analyze various objectives of Pollock's stand-up comic act. The first objective is to remind Germans of their guilt in perpetrating the Holocaust. But that's not the major focus of Pollock's humor. It seems to me that the major focus of his humor is the awkward, pretentious, self-serving, even self-righteous manner in which anything to do with Jews in Germany is dealt with in German society. Because he's the son of a survivor, Pollock feels entitled to arrogate to himself the right to speak, that is, to criticize how Germans deal with Jews. Therefore, he says, "I'm allowed, I'm a Jew. I'm a Jew, therefore I have the voice, I have the right to criticize Germans for the awkward way in which they deal with Jews in German society." But as I continue, it seemed to me as I continued to think about it that he doesn't like this awkwardness between German non-Jews and German Jews. Like most German Jews, he wants to be normal and he wants to be considered normal. And so to this end, he aspires in the second act that I analyze in my chapter, "Let's All Be Jews," he aspires to normalize the relations between German Jews and German non-Jews. But how he proposes to do this, how he proposes to normalize relations between German non-Jews and German Jews, that's what I think is funny. And he envisions a messianic future, but not one in which, under normal circumstances, though I see Marion Caplan is here, one of the preeminent historians of German Jewish history, for example. And I think that Marion will agree with me that generally speaking, in German Jewish history, German Jews have tried to assimilate to German society. That's the way that things usually have worked throughout history, for better or for worse. Pollock, though, imagines a society, a German society in which non-Jews assimilate to become Jews. And so he envisions a society, a messianic society, in which German non-Jews become Jews. And not only Jews like most of us, but also Hasidic Jews. And of course, it's Hasidic Jews who, after all, embodied Nazi Germany's phantasmagoric nightmare. So in effect, Pollock creates a utopian, or one might say, depending on one's point of view, dystopian, post-Holocaust fantasy of Jewry's final victory over Germandom. And of course, that's what's funny, right? He turns the tables on the Germans and says, "We Jews, you're going to become like us." And we're actually the ones who are going to be prevailing over German non-Jews. Now, I could end, depending on all of you, I could end my presentation with the song Lasst uns alle Juden sein. I could sing a couple of verses, or I could play it from the internet. Which do you prefer? What do you think, Avi? Should I sing?
Yeah, you can sing.
All right. So I'll sing. Maybe all of you will join with me, because there's supposed to be a little bit Freilach. It's Pesach, and we wanted to have a nice in the midst of these trying, unsettling, very strange times. We're doing this in part because we want to bring a little joy or light into our lives. So I'll sing. It goes like this. He says, "This is the main refrain. Come, let's all be Jews. Come, let's all be Jews. Come, let's all be Jews. You and you and you belong there too. Let's all be Jews." It goes like this. Lasst uns alle Juden sein. Kommt, lasst uns alle Juden sein. Kommt, lasst uns alle Juden sein. Du und du und du. Auch du gehörst dazu. Lasst uns alle Juden sein. Thank you very much for your attention, and I do apologize for my terrible voice.
That was great, Gabi. Shakoyach. Nicely done. Thank you, Gabi. So we go from Germany to Australia. Jordy is here. So the next chapter in the volume is Jordana Silverstein, who's a historian based at the University of Melbourne. And she's the author of Anxious Histories, narrating the Holocaust in Jewish communities at the beginning of the 21st century, and co-editor of In the Shadows of Memory, the Holocaust and the Third Generation. And her chapter in the volume is called, quote, "The Holocaust Was the Worst," unquote, remembering the Holocaust through third generation jokes. So go ahead, Jordy. Tell us about third generation jokes.
Yes, thank you so much to the editors. It was, you did such a wonderful job, and it's such an amazing volume, and I really appreciated having the opportunity to think about this side of third generation memory. And I also want to start by acknowledging that I'm on the unceded land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and paying my respects to elders past and present. And thinking about the recurrences of genocide in our histories and our memories. But so I was thinking about, in my chapter, I think about Australian, or primarily Melburnian, third generation Holocaust memory. So the memories, the jokes of the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. And what the way I thought about it, and the way I think that these jokes come through is quite ephemeral, that these aren't often, so I wasn't looking at sort of the books or the comedy sets or the songs so much, but sort of the one-liners, sort of the throwaway things that happen amongst members of the third generation, and the ways that it sort of works to bind members of the third generation together, so to create a community of rememberers. And these jokes are deliberately bad taste. They're deliberately, or at the edges of bad taste, I guess. They're deliberately kind of absurdist. I guess, anyone who's sort of had a conversation with Dave will be familiar with this manner of joking, I think. He's quite the expert at this art form. I'll read just a couple of lines of the kinds of things I was trying to gesture towards. And I think what these jokes do is they're a symbol of the excess of memory, of how impossible it is to live with this memory, of the way that, how do we deal with the sheer loss, but also survival? How do we deal with the knowledge of what our grandparents went through? And it's an impossibility, I think. So I think the humour is kind of a bubbling up of this impossibility. And it has become really a vernacular. It's such a common thing for these people that I'm talking about, the ways in which they talk. That when they talk to each other, it's constant. You don't really find conversations between members of the third generation that don't in some way invoke the Holocaust in a humorous way. So it testifies, I think, to the constant presence of the Holocaust in these post memories, in this way of, in this everyday life, and then lack of knowledge about what to do with that memory, and how to bear the history. So these kinds of memories, so I've said in my chapter, the conversations between members of the third generation are peppered with jokes about being afraid of heights, fearing sudden death or dismemberment, seeing therapists, dealing with our families and their intimate involvement in our lives, or analysing our eating habits, inevitably disordered in some way. Any train travel provides the possibility of joke making, particularly train travel in Europe. Warnings to avoid trains going east are quite common. At a workshop for members of the third generation, which was held in early 2017 at the Jewish Museum in Sydney, one participant asked, who doesn't love to talk about their shit, to laughs of recognition? Another spoke of the everyday guilt we carry, but to comic effect. One friend who lived at the time in New York with her US partner and who was regularly visited by friends from Melbourne would find her partner commenting on the ways that the Holocaust would come up in every conversation that her Melbourne friends had. This became a source of humour for my friend in her conversations with other Melbourne Jews who were in on the joke. So I'll leave it there. But I think, this is kind of the way that Holocaust humour is so ever present amongst these members of the third generation.
Thank you, Jordy. So one of the things we can see is, and I think you're getting at the point here, is the many, many different functions of humor in these different contexts, both this type of identity humor, political uses of humor, social, cultural, psychological uses of humor, humor as a weapon, right? This is one of the things that becomes clear in the many, many different ways that it's used. So in the volume, actually my chapter is the next one. So I'll just say a couple of things about my chapter and keep it brief. But the title of my chapter is Yad Vashem, You So Fine, which is a quote from an Eretz Nehederet sketch about Jewish youth going on a Taglit birthright trip to Israel. And this picture that you see here, the cover picture, is a picture from inside Amy Schumer's sketch that's called Museum of Boyfriend Wardrobe Atrocities. And one of the things that I do in my sketch is to examine the differences between the uses of Holocaust humor in America and in Israel, and suggest that through a serious analysis of humor, we can learn a great deal about the place of the Holocaust in contemporary identity of both American and Israeli Jewish communities. So the chapter compares humor in Israeli sketch comedies, like you can see here, a Chamishia Kamarit, the Feldermaus sketches, and a spoof of, for example, Claude Lanzmann, and a spoof of Claude Lanzmann's Shoah and Schindler's List, including as well an Eretz Nehederet sketch that makes fun of birthright trips that block out 30 minutes for a visit to Yad Vashem so that American Jewish youth can feel sad and simultaneously text their parents to make donations to Israel so that, quote, there won't be a second Holocaust because the sequel is never as good as the original, unquote. And another sketch that is on the Israeli Eretz Nehederet, which is kind of like the Daily Show, a mockumentary style sketch that's called Hamachaneh Rak Echad Zoche, the camp, only one wins, which dupes unsuspecting Israelis into participating in a survivor-style reality TV show where they can decide if they want to be Jews or Nazis. This was a real sketch that was on the show. Two more recent brilliant sketches on the show HaYehudim Ba'im, The Jews Are Coming, including a sketch which looks at a bungled execution of Adolf Eichmann, who needed to be shown how to conduct a hanging. Here you can see Eichmann, played by Moni Moshonov, telling the bumbling Israeli guards, if you want to do something right, you have to do it yourself, before he actually literally hangs himself, to another sketch called The Final Solution 2.0, where Nazis gather in an underground bunker in 1956 to plot their final solution 2.0, which in this case is an attempt to forever deny Israel victory in the Eurovision Song Contest. Which again, this is a way of using Holocaust humor, or humor that invokes the Holocaust, to make light of the ways in which anti-Semitism is invoked at every turn, or the ways in which the memory of the Holocaust is politicized. And I compare this to examples that we can see in the American context. For example, episodes of Curb Your Enthusiasm, which many of you will know, like the famous Survivor episode, or a sketch on Nathan For You called Summit Ice, where he develops a clothing line which he will use for Holocaust education purposes, and a brilliant Amy Schumer sketch called Museum of Boyfriend Wardrobe Atrocities that is a pitch-perfect critique of Holocaust museums and the trivialization of terms like atrocity and catastrophe. And I'll share a link to the sketch in the chat box, so if people want to watch it, they can watch the sketch. Here you can see Amy Schumer invokes a pile of 5,200 Crocs, which represent the cumulative effect of boyfriend wardrobe atrocities, of course, directly thinking about it next to the piles of shoes that one might encounter. A little girl at the end of the tour wearing red juxtaposed to black and white, a Schindler's List reference, asks her adult chaperone, did this really happen? Meaning the Museum of Boyfriend Wardrobe Atrocities. And she says, yes, it did. It really did. So one of the things that I like to think about is what is the use of this Holocaust humor in the American versus the Israeli context, where humor in Israel reflects an anxiety over, humor in America perhaps reflects an anxiety over forgetting, over the ways in which remembering the Holocaust has become a stand-in for Jewish identity, and also the ways in which these types of memorial practices are supposed to create a feeling of enforced sadness, whereas humor in Israel, where the Shoah, as Liat pointed out, is much too central to Israeli national identity to be forgotten, instead becomes a political tool that ultimately critiques the very centrality of the Holocaust in that culture. As distance from the event grows, the Shoah continues to assume a central role in both Israeli and American Jewish identity. And so humor about the Holocaust not only mirrors the concerns of each society, but also reflects the degree to which a vague sense of collective memory of the Holocaust has replaced any historical specificity of the event itself. And I'll share the link to the Amy Schumer Museum of Boyfriend Wardrobe Atrocities, so people can watch it on their own time. And with that, I will turn it over to David Slucki, who's going to talk about representations of the Holocaust in American sitcoms in his chapter, Did You Ever See Our Show? Holocaust Comedy in American Sitcoms. David, you're muted.
Now I'm the techno idiot. I messaged Avi privately before and during Liat's talk and said, I don't know if I'm allowed to laugh and if I should turn my camera off so people didn't see me laughing at the tweets. So I just admitted to it. So there, it's out in the open. So my chapter was born in probably about 10 years ago when I was finished my dissertation, was sitting on the couch watching back-to-back episodes of Curb Your Enthusiasm because I really just didn't know what else to do. And I knew I didn't want to write anything more that dealt with handwritten Yiddish manuscripts. So I thought I'm going to do something else for a little while and write about sitcoms. And so that kind of was bubbling for a little while. And in my chapter, I look at particularly sitcoms in the United States and the ways in which the Holocaust really by now has become ubiquitous. I think it kind of creeps on you a little bit. You know, people tend to know the Survivor episode of Curb or the Soup Nazi episode of Seinfeld. But what people, I don't think, realize is that pretty much every sitcom that they've watched has some kind of Holocaust jokes. And I keep a kind of log as I see them come up. Some jokes about Nazis, about Anne Frank, about the Holocaust. And we can debate whether Holocaust humor and humor about the poking fun at the Nazis are in the same ballpark, but that's something I deal with a little in the chapter. What I argue is that what these comics and sitcom producers are responding to is this sort of increased sacralization of the Holocaust in American life. That is the sort of sense of the Holocaust as holy and outside history, an event that has specific kind of rules and conventions and etiquette attached to it when we talk about it or remember it. And comedians famously do not like following rules or conventions, and they don't abide by taboos. So what they do, and I'll just read a short paragraph to kind of get to the crux of my argument. This is from page 286 for anyone following at home. More effectively, perhaps, than any other medium, sitcoms have held up a mirror to their audiences, demanding that they think about their own role in participating in and perpetuating certain ways of thinking about the Holocaust. They have challenged their audiences to consider the danger of a memorial culture that disembodies the victims from the events and turns the Holocaust into a spectacle, bereft of real meaning and reduced to entertainment. Another show to be consumed, a role to be performed. These shows have much to tell historians about how popular memory of the Holocaust has changed and will continue to transform in the years to come. And in particular, I look, since the 1990s, I think there's been this explosion, which is partly like owing to the popularity of Schindler's List and the opening of the US Holocaust Memorial Museum and the expansion of the show Visual History Archive. So there's all these sort of factors in the early 90s that sort of lead to the rise of Holocaust memory in US culture, and sitcoms kind of tap into that. So I look at Seinfeld, I look at Curb Your Enthusiasm, I look at the Sarah Silverman program. And Sarah Silverman, I think in this episode, the very final episode of the series called Wowschwitz, does it more effectively than anyone, kind of shockingly and more effectively, sort of levels this critique against a memorial culture that kind of she argues, I think, trivializes the Holocaust. I look at Transparent, which again, we can debate whether it should be considered a sitcom in this company, but I argue it does. But these are really like, here I list it: South Park, American Dad, Family Guy, Sex and the City, Broad City, Difficult People, The Office, Mrs. Maisel. They all have Holocaust jokes peppered throughout. So I'm sort of curious, like, how we got to this point where it's almost mandatory, I argue, if you want to be a sitcom and seen as edgy, to do Holocaust jokes, but I don't think it's edgy at all anymore. So I want to just finish by showing a 1 minute clip, and I opened the chapter with this from the CW series Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, and some of you will know this and will be nodding along, and I could probably sing it too, but I think it's better to have Patty Lupone and Tova Feldschuh singing than me. So I'm going to share my screen here. So tell me if that comes up. Just give a nod if that comes up. Great. All right. That's about 1.5 minutes. And it basically, just to give you the context, Rebecca Bunch, who is living in California, returns to a childhood home in Scarsdale, New York for a family simcha, a bar mitzvah. And she just is convinced it's going to be terrible. And her boyfriend at the time, who is not Jewish, is just having an absolute ball. And she's kind of baffled by how anyone could have fun at a family bar mitzvah. Can you hear that music?
No.
No audio? No audio?
You have to turn on the computer audio.
Okay. I'll do that. Where do I do that?
You have to turn on the setting on Zoom that allows you to play computer audio.
All right. You know what? I'm going to do what Avi did, and I'm going to share the link then and not waste everyone's time trying to with you watching me fiddle around. So thank you, everyone. This has been a ton of fun, and I'm so glad the book's out there. I'm so glad to see everyone's faces and to be talking about it live. And thank you, everyone, also for sticking around, because there's a big treat to come with Bob and Ferne.
Thank you, David. So we saved sort of the best treat for last. We have dessert here at the end. And that's really, and I appreciate Ferne and Bob sort of waiting patiently for the end. So our last chapter in the volume is called The Last Laugh. And it's a chapter written by Robert Edwards and Ferne Pearlstein. Robert Edwards is a graduate of Stanford University's MA program in documentary film and the writer-director of the feature films Land of the Blind, starring Ralph Fiennes and Donald Sutherland, and When I Live My Life Over Again, also known as One More Time, starring Christopher Walken and Amber Heard. And Ferne Pearlstein is a prize-winning documentary filmmaker whose work has been screened and broadcast around the world. As a director, her most recent film is the critically acclaimed The Last Laugh, which was released theatrically in over 25 cities, broadcast on PBS's Independent Lens, and screened at over 100 film festivals, including Tribeca, Jerusalem, and Munich. Ferne is a member of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences and the Brooklyn Jewish Hall of Fame, which sounds pretty cool. So it's a pleasure to turn it over to Ferne and Bob to talk about The Last Laugh.
Well, we're unmuted. Thank you so much for having us. And David and Avi and Gabby, thank you so much. I mean, I've been collaborating with you guys for a while now, so this has been a perfect way to do it. And today's a special day to do this because the star of The Last Laugh, Rene Firestone, who is an Auschwitz survivor, is 96 today. So it's very nice to be able to do this today and have her listen, probably not live, but we'll do the best we can. And I also want to have a shout out to Kent Kirschenbaum, who's listening, and he was the person who wrote the original paper that inspired the film. But we're going to show you a clip. Hopefully it will work, but we wanted to tell you a couple things. One is that for those of you who have not seen The Last Laugh, Rene Firestone is the woman who, you know, we interviewed comedians, but she sort of is the heart and soul of the film who guides us through, is it okay to laugh? And at a Q&A we did a couple years ago in Montana, a reporter said to her, you know, what did you think when, you know, she asked you to be in this film about humor? And Renee said that it was the first Holocaust documentary that she had seen where it was about the humanity of the survivors and not the inhumanity, because most Holocaust films are about, you know, all the tragedy, and this was about humor, and only if you are human can you laugh. So I always think of that as, you know, coming from her who gives us such permission to laugh when it's, you know, appropriate. And we wanted to share another story because of what's going on in the world right now, and I'll let Bob tell you that.
Yeah, we're fortunate to have in the film the Israeli satirist Edgar Keret, and he tells a really incredible story about his father who survived the war, and he survived the war by hiding out in a hole in the ground with his family. And Edgar says to his father after the war, "How is it that you're such a happy, optimistic, and believing man after what you went through?" And he says that my father thought for a second and he said, "I have a theory that every person in the world is the world champion in something. The tragedy is most of us never figure out what that thing is. You might be an amazing tennis player, but you spent your whole life playing the piano." And he said, "It was during the war I discovered my true talent. I'm extremely good at sleeping." And what happened is when we were in the hole in the ground, I slept. And every once in a while I would wake up and I would say to my father, "Is the war over?" And he would say, "No." And I would go back to sleep. And we thought that was very appropriate for the social distancing and a hunkering down and sheltering in place that all of us are doing right now. So we'd like to play you a clip now from the film.
Hopefully
this will work. I'm going to share our screen here.
Oh, no. Yeah, that's right.
All right. Okay, let's see if this works.
When I was a kid in the mountains, I would do and I would get a lot of laughs with Hitler. And a few Jews after the show would say, you know, that's not in such good taste, you know? And I'd say, I don't care. I really don't give a shit what's in good taste.
No comedian ever in the Catskills would come and tell jokes about the Holocaust. They would string this guy up.
You know what I was careful about, honestly? I would do this a lot, but I wouldn't wear the swastika. Not for a while. Not till I did The Producers.
Humor healed us, especially in the Catskills. You know, we would go and my mother would laugh like I never saw her laugh. There was a release because we were, you know, it was like a kind of community where they felt safe and they weren't the other.
I started writing jokes for stand-up comedians who played the Catskill Mountains. I was 21, they were like 50, 55. I was a generation removed from that.
Jokes about your wives in those days. Terrible. And you hear about the man in room 302. He came back, he found his best friend in bed with his wife. He said, Morris, I have to, but you.
I would write some jokes for them about, you know, that my uncle was an all-round camper at Auschwitz, okay? And they would laugh in the car, or the band would laugh, but there's not a chance in hell that you can tell that to an audience.
I was very brave then. Maybe I'm not so brave now, but I was very, very brave because it was in questionable taste in 1948 when I worked in the, right, 2 years, 3 years after the end of the war, to be doing Hitler bits.
Time makes a difference. Obviously, nobody cares if you do Inquisition jokes.
The Inquisition, let's begin the Inquisition. Look out, Sam. We have a mission to convert the Jews. Had I done the Inquisition as a movie in 1492, I would have been in a lot of trouble. But enough time had gone by. Confess, don't be boring. 5 centuries had gone by. And so it was okay. It's better to lose your skull cap than your skull.
Somebody once said, tragedy plus time equals comedy. And I always felt like, why wait?
It's time opens up different avenues of thought and acceptance.
So that is, I guess, are we ending the night?
We'll give Mel Brooks the last word.
I can also share the link on Amazon Prime to the film for anyone who wants to see it.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Ferne. And thank you, Bob. And it's amazing, I think, for all of us to sort of end with Mel Brooks really sort of getting the last word, because he is such a monumental and influential figure in sort of this this question of what are the boundaries and what is appropriate. I want to make sure, I don't know if Gabi or David, you have anything you want to add, but if not, I will just say thank you so much to all of our wonderful contributors, and thank you to Wayne State University Press for supporting this project, and really just a hearty thank you to everybody for being here tonight, for joining us for this event, and for sharing your evening with us. And I look forward to all of us having a chance where we can get together in person and spend some time together. I wish everyone much continued health, stay safe, stay distant, and let us look forward to a future when we can get together and discuss the book together. So thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Sei gesund.
Thank you. It was great
Thanks,
seeing you.
everyone.
Yeah.
Bye.
Hey, bye.
Avi, can I just quickly chime in one more time and say thank you to all the folks at Wayne State, particularly to Kathy and Annie and Emily and Kristen and Christina and Jamie, who've all been immensely supportive of the project and have just made things run so smoothly. So thank you to Wayne State again.
If I could add one last thing. So I remember Annie, we were talking with Annie about a year ago, and we said to ourselves, oh, this might be so provocative. And then she said something that really resonated with me. She said, that's the reason that it's a good book, because it is going to be provocative, right? So I want to thank you, Avi. Thank you, David. Thank you, all contributors. It's been such a wonderful project. And I hope that we can have more evenings like this when we can talk about the book, because I actually think that's an important book and worthwhile talking about and thinking about. So thank you, everyone. And happy Easter. Chag Pesach Sameach. Be healthy and be safe.
Chag
Thank
Sameach.
you.
Everybody be well.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.